Hello, and welcome to the Council's Table podcast. I'm your host, Spencer O'Neill, and today we're not going to have any guests. We're going to do something a little bit different than what we've done in the past. Today, I would like to spend some time discussing sort of the anatomy and, well, not anatomy, but the psychology of a guilty plea. You know, one of the things about being a defense attorney is that it's many times in the best interest of your client to enter a plea and to take a deal. A lot of what our job is going out and negotiating. In fact, it's a majority of our job. In the criminal justice system, I believe it's 98 or 99% of cases are resolved in some sort of a plea at the time of the resolution. Meaning that, the other very small amount of cases that resolve end up resolving with a trial. And trials are what we spend most of our time talking about, and as an attorney, it's what, honestly, we get most excited about. Anybody that tells you that they became a defense attorney to go out and plea people to a case, well, I don't really know what to say about that. I would just say that's not the reason that I got into it. I became a defense attorney because I wanted to try cases. I wanted to be a trial attorney. I wanted to go into a courtroom and fight for my clients. And I wanted to go and, express their viewpoints and fight for their liberty. Liberty that, was taken from them or is about to be taken from them if they're found to be guilty at that trial. Today I decided that I wanted to speak on guilty pleas because there was a very specific circumstance that occurred. I was set to have a trial that started today, and the trial ended up not happening. Now, here, sitting in retrospect, what I would say is that I believe that my client taking the plea saved a very large portion of his life. And that once the plea was done, there was an extreme feeling of relief. And it wasn't relief because I didn't have to go and do a job. In fact, going to trial is part of the job that I like the most. So doing the job is not the issue. The reason that there was relief is because, I've been representing this person for about 12 months now. And over 12 months, you get to know people. People don't do this job because they don't care about people. In fact, they do this job generally because they care about people greatly. And that was how I felt. I felt as though I cared about this person greatly. And the fact that he finally came to the realization that this was his best option probably saved him 10 to 15 years in prison. Now, to tell you up front, he did receive a prison sentence. He received a prison sentence of 5.5 years. And that sounds terrible. It sounds terrible to think that someone would be going to prison for 5.5 years and you would feel relieved about it. However, and I'll lay the circumstances out, I won't name the person, but I will lay some of the circumstances out. But when you hear the circumstances, I believe that you'll probably come to an agreement with me that this was his best option, is his best way to go forward. And I'm hoping that for some of you that think that attorneys just want people to plea for whatever personal reasons that they want them to plea, you'll hear this circumstance and this story and come to the realization that sometimes entering the plea when someone tells you to do so, if you're being advised by an attorney, they're not doing this because they're lazy or they don't want to do it. They're doing it because, they genuinely believe it's in your best interest, as it was in this case. So, to lay some backstory, so my client was arrested last summer of 2022. And he was arrested for allegedly selling fentanyl and selling what they call is a cathinone It's the technical name for the chemical is dimethylpentylone. This one was, but it's a cathinone, which is sort of similar to like an MDMA or a Molly. Some of you may know those words. And when the case first came out, he was offered, I believe, 44 months to resolve his case, and that was offered because of the nature of the chemicals that were alleged to be sold, and something called a score sheet and his criminal history. Now, a score sheet, for those that don't know, in the state of Florida at least, when you are alleged to have committed a crime and the state of Florida is prosecuting you, they do, at least in felony court, they do what's called a score sheet, and they take your prior criminal history, they take the charges that you're facing currently, they take if it's a violation of probation, or if you've disappeared from probation and done what they've called absconding. They look to see if there's victim, and if there's a victim, if there's injury, and if there's injury, what kind of injury, and they would put a certain number of points to what type of injury it is, and they add all these things up and they get a score essentially. And then they take that score and they minus 28, and then they times it by 0.75 for whatever reason, and they come up with a number. And if the number is over 12, then that means that you score mandatory prison, because you go to prison when you are sentenced to anything more than a year. If you are sentenced to anything more than a year in jail, then you would go to a prison sentence and you would be sent to the Department of Corrections. So if you score above 12 after that math equation is done, where you minus 20, you add all the points up, minus 28 and times it by 0.75, then each one of those points counts for a month. And if you're over 12, then you're over 12 months. Even if it's 12.5, that's 12 and a half months. And you would have a minimum sentence, so it sets a floor at that 12 and a half, hypothetically, if that was what your score was. In his circumstance, his score was greater than that. It was close to what his original offer was, and he elected not to take his original plea deal. The side of the story that I got from him was that he didn't do it, and that he doesn't sell fentanyl, and that this was obviously a mistake, and he wanted to go forward with his case. Now, in his circumstance, he is in a case that is a confidential informant case. Now, a confidential informant is a person that will go out and work, essentially, is what they call it, for a sheriff's office or a narcotics unit or a police department, or whomever it is that they are working for. And they're doing that generally in order to work off a charge or a sentence in which they've accrued on their own. So in a confidential informant case, you're generally dealing with a person that's got a criminal case that they're facing. They've got a pressure to try to perform so they can get rid of their own charges. And the general way that you look at these cases is you look towards their incentives, and then you try to figure out how you can make an argument that they're not trustworthy and that what they're saying isn't true. So in this circumstance, we had the confidential informant disclosed. And one of the things to know about whether the confidential informant is disclosed or not is because they're confidential, you don't generally find those things out. You don't find out their identities. And you don't find those out unless you demand to know them and you enforce your constitutional rights and your right to discovery. So in this circumstance, we did that. Now, one thing that may be interesting for some people to learn is that there is no requirement that the state give a plea offer. They don't have to give anybody a plea offer. There's no requirement that it be done. There's a general practice in doing so because, like I stated earlier, so many cases are resolved with a plea. It's either 98 or 99%. It's extremely high. So plea offers are done and negotiations are a large part of the job. However, in this circumstance, when you demand that the confidential informant be disclosed, what happens is generally the state will say, if you demand the confidential informant's information, then they're not going to negotiate with you and your plea offers are revoked. So once you decide to get the information that you need through discovery, you essentially have no plea offer. You're choosing to go to trial blindly, is sort of the predicament that you're put into. In this circumstance, my client decided that he wanted to see the discovery against him, that he wanted to know what was being used against him, and we chose to go forward with having the confidential informant disclosed. Now there's a video, and in the video that we got to see, you can see my client, allegedly selling this person some fentanyl and then what he calls Molly. Now there's parts of the video that are debatable. You can't technically see a hand-to-hand transaction because the video is recorded on a phone. So you the confidential informant kind of sets it down next to their leg, and all you can see is their leg, but you can see some things. And you can hear what's being said, and there's some very damning statements in the video. Now, what happened after that was that my client wrote a letter to the state attorney, and he did so without my sort of knowledge. He just did so on his own, explaining his situation and trying to see if he could get his case dismissed on his own. What he stated was that he never sold the confidential informant anything, that if you watch the video, you can't see any money being exchanged, which is debatable, and that he only gave her drugs. He never sold the confidential informant any drugs. So, the problem with that statement, and for those of you that don't know, I hope that you'll learn from this, is that in the state of Florida, if you're looking at a sale of a controlled substance, it's actually not required that there be any transfer of money or any transfer of value at all. You can deliver said drug to a person, and it's the same as if they were to sell it to them. This was difficult for my client to understand. There were lots of statements that were made as far as, I didn't get any money, I just gave it to them. It's like two people sharing a beer, which I constantly had to show him the statute and show him the delivery and explain to him that, just giving the drug from one person to another is the same as selling it. And it's the same charge. They can call it whatever they want, sale of this, but even if there's no value that it's exchanged, it's the same charge. It's possession with intent to sell. A sale or delivery of a controlled substance is a quote-unquote sale of a controlled substance. The state attorney essentially had in their hands what amounted to a signed confession to the charges. And my client had essentially talked himself into a position by writing a letter, which I clearly did not approve of, and told him about later as far as why it was a problem. And at that point in time, the client just became combative. And we dealt with combativeness between ourselves for months at that point. Spencer O'Neill here from the Counsel's Table podcast. Just want to take this opportunity to ask you guys to like and subscribe to the video, follow the channel wherever it is that you get your podcast, and enjoy the last half of this episode. Thank you all very much for your support, and this is Counsel's Table. So at this point, I've got a combative client who's unwilling to listen to what the statute says in relation to what the allegations against him are. And all I can do is continue to look at the case to try to figure out if there's a way to make an argument either against one or both of the charges. And, over time, we came up with an argument where we could try to make against one of the counts. But the other one, we really didn't have much of an argument because that was what he had admitted to providing to the confidential informant. Essentially, in the letter, he stated that he did not sell one of the substances, that he doesn't sell or distribute or have anything to do with one of the substances, but that his friend had come over and he had given the other substance to that person because it was a friendly gesture and that there was no sale. And that essentially is what I stated was the admission. It's the signed confession, essentially, because he signed the document and mailed it to the state attorney from the jail. So, this is an unsolicited statement. It's not something that was asked of from him. And as stated, there's not much you can really do about that at that point except try to figure out if there's something in what he said happened that I can work with. Because here's the other part. When you send a letter to the state attorney, you are essentially telling them what your defense is. One of the main things about defending cases is that the element of surprise is extremely important. You don't want to run around and tell the state or the judge or anybody what your defense is if you intend to try a case. You want to keep that tight to the chest. There is no benefit in letting anybody know what it is that you're trying to do, no matter how much you think there is. If you have no intention of trying the case and you want to negotiate the case out, then yeah, you might lay it out for the state and explain to them what their problems are and then try to negotiate from a position of strength as opposed to negotiating from a position of weakness where you don't have an argument to make. However, if you're dead set on going to trial and you're saying I did not do this, then there's no benefit to letting them know anything. And, you can't talk your way out of a charge generally. It's not going to happen. A lot of people think that they can talk their way out of it. Some of our clients are manipulative people, sociopaths even, and they believe that they can talk their way out of it because that's what they do with their problems. They try to talk either out of them or around them or away from them, or they'll use whataboutisms where they'll say, well, what about this person, or what about this, or what about this, and try to change the subject and deflect, right? Well, in this circumstance, his attempt at deflection backfired tremendously. And, the state had already decided they weren't going to negotiate and we were heading towards a trial. So now that it's over, I can tell you that we've gone up until the day of trial. And what occurred was actually quite tremendous. So I started this off by telling you that I was going to tell you about the psychology of a guilty plea and how I was relieved that one had occurred. And even though we didn't go to a trial, I feel as though the plea that was taken was in the best interest of my client, and the fact that it was taken may have saved, in fact, I'm certain that it saved, 10 to 15 years, if not more, of this man's life. So, last week, this person was rearrested. First off, they had bonded out of jail about 5 months ago, so this person was out in the community, and they were rearrested last week, the week before the trial, for allegedly selling another controlled substance to another confidential informant. Which, what do? You just move on to the trial that you have in front of you, and you deal with the next problem as it comes. However, something did tremendous occur, and that is that this person had essentially 3 days from Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. They went in Thursday and came out on a Monday to court and had 3 days to kind of detox off the drugs that they were using. And while they were still not exactly clear-headed because they were coming off of, the drugs that they were heavily using, they were significantly more clear-headed than when they had gone into jail 3 days ago. I truly believe that if this person had not been arrested, there would not have been a plea, there would have been no making any sense to the person, and it would have resulted in a 20-year prison sentence, is what I believe would have happened. Instead, what occurred is that I had an opportunity to speak to this person with a somewhat clear head, and we got to discuss the ins and outs of what the case was with a more clear head than I had gotten to speak to him in about approximately 5 months. And at the end of it, essentially, what I told the person was that I cared about them, and that I didn't want the next time that the two of us saw each other that we were going to be old men. I didn't want us to be old men the next time we saw each other. There was a conversation that was had where the statement was made by the person that they didn't want to take the plea because they were afraid of a death in their family, and also they didn't want to take the plea because they felt like their life would be over. And we had to have a discussion on why, first off, going to trial on a case where you've essentially signed a confession is not a good option. And you're certainly looking at a larger sentence after a trial. And that there is nothing about your current circumstance that you can do to prevent the death of the person that you love in your family. And furthermore, that when you're in your mid-40s and you're looking at a 4.5, 5-year prison sentence, that your life isn't over. That in fact what you're doing is you're deciding to save life. You're deciding to save your life. You're deciding to save your 50s and your early 60s and the amount of work life that you have left and your ability to create equity, and the hope that when you are done with your sentence, you can return to your livelihood, of which this person does have. This person has a trade, and they have a criminal history from when they were younger, and they were able to go into that trade. So there's no reason to believe that they wouldn't be able to go back into that trade in the future. That the choice between going to trial and not going to trial was essentially the choice between preserving your life and throwing away what's left of it, at least the parts that mattered. If this person had decided to go to trial and the things had gone the way that they were clearly going to go, then they were looking at a sentence where they would have been getting out around the time that they were going to retire and have nothing, have no body to go out and use to do the laborious job that they do on a daily basis for their trade, and have no time left to collect that equity and try not to be completely indigent and completely dependent on a Social Security system, of which they would not get very much because they had not paid into it, if they got anything. I'm not even sure. So, after this conversation, I was able to speak to the state attorney and to get an offer that was slightly lower than what they had expressed earlier that day. And we were able to resolve the case with a plea of no contest. Not only were we able to resolve the case with a plea of no contest, but we were able to resolve the new arrest for the similar charge, for the similar action, as well as the new case. And those two cases were resolved with what's called a concurrent sentence, meaning that you serve both sentences at the same time. And we were able to get a slightly lower amount of prison than what had been offered earlier that day, as well as we were able to get all of his prior jail credit awarded towards his sentence, both in the old case, which he had a right to it there, as well as the new case, of which he only had a right to 3 or 4 days at that point. So at the end of it, I'm not sure how he felt, but I can tell you that as his attorney, I felt extremely relieved, and I felt as though I had saved this man 10 years, if not plus, in prison, that I had saved him his ability to possibly have a future, and that my speaking to him on a level that was personal, on a level that had to do with love, on a level that had to deal with reality, was able to break through and save this man a terrible, terrible fate that he was inflicting honestly upon himself. Let's not forget that in the criminal justice system, as a defense attorney, you're constantly dealing with people that, not always, but a lot of the times bring trouble upon themselves. And when you are a person that constantly brings trouble upon yourself, you have a tendency to look towards others, like I stated it earlier about whataboutism and how this isn't fair and what happened to this person, and just the multitude of excuses that people make up in their heads for why things are happening to them. In this circumstance, I was able to break through, and I felt extremely relieved. I relieved to the point to when I made it back to my office, I sat at my desk, and I took a deep breath, and I started to sob. And just thinking about it now, I kind of feel like I want to sob. But the reason that I'm putting this episode out, and the reason that I wanted to put this perspective out, is because I felt it was important for maybe some of those that are in a similar position to me to know that, there are others that are doing the same as you are, and that they're trying to do it from a place of love. And even if it's not always seen, or if it's not appreciated, it's work that needs to be done. Also hoping that for some of those that are out there that either have gone through or maybe going through in the future a situation where they could be entering a plea to something, don't look at your attorney necessarily as this person that's just trying to shove you down the system. I would say that the most people that get into this line of work, specifically criminal defense work, are essentially social workers. I spend a lot of time doing a lot of things that have nothing to do with really what my job is, whether that's collecting items for clients that are about to be thrown away by their ex-girlfriends or ex-boyfriends and hiding them in a closet, or collecting materials for sex offenders that are about to live in a homeless situation so they have a tent or a pillow. You'd be surprised to see the number of things and the types of things that criminal defense attorneys do for people that are destitute and desperate. And sometimes the most important thing that we can do is we can tell them the truth. And for this person, I felt like I told them the truth, and the result was the best result that could have happened. And for that, I was extremely proud. This was Counsel's Table Podcast. It is Spencer O'Neill, your host of the Counsel's Table Podcast. Thank you all for listening. I know that we didn't have any guests this week, and it was just me talking. I tried to keep it to a reasonable level. I hope that the content was enjoyable. I do plan to do some more episodes like this in the future where it's just me expanding on a topic. It may not be a personal subject like it was today, although I expect that in the future you will hear more personal subjects like this. It may be an issue. I expect to do an episode in the future concerning the current status of medicinal cannabis in the state of Florida, and the do's and don'ts and the mistakes that people make when looking at what they can and cannot do with their medicinal cards. So look out for that episode. Beyond that, I want to say once again, please like and subscribe to the channel. Please follow the podcast wherever it is that you get this podcast. And thank you for listening. This was the Counsel's Table Podcast.